Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Fitzgerald, coming to you from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am here to introduce our Executive Director for the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, Dr. Rob Citino. He's also our Samuel Zemurray Stone Senior Historian, and he is about to come on and talk to us a little bit more about Pearl Harbor. So don't forget to ask us questions in the Facebook chat. And again, thanks for being here. Dr. Citino, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Kate. Expertly done. This is all pretty new to me. I have Kate, I have Chrissy back at her place, and we're all putting this together. I have a couple of colleagues from the Institute, so we're all in, as you might say, undisclosed locations, but by the magic of electricity, we're all able to bring you this program today. These are tough times right now, and I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone out there that. You're all reading the same news reports I am, but I'm a historian. That's what I do for a living. I read about the past, and I think about the past. One of the great things about history is that you can see how the American people, how people all over the world have come back in the past from tough times, from crises. The infinite creativity of the human being in response to crisis or in response to problems has always been, for me, what history is all about. So how do you recover from what it's called, what it was in 1941? How do you recover from disaster to go on to bigger and even better things? And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today in the course. I'll probably have 30 minutes or so of my own words, and then throw it open to questions, and I'm happy to go back and forth with you on almost anything you want to ask me. But that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. Looking at one of the worst disasters in U.S. history, U.S. military history, but really history more broadly, the successful Japanese strike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Kate is working my slides, so if she could throw up the first slide there, and we'll start moving forward. There's an absolutely iconic view of the destroyer, the USS Shaw, going up like a rocket when a Japanese bomb had hit its ammunition magazine and just completely destroying the ship with the loss of life that you would expect. So before we get into the meat of this talk, this is going to be the first in a series of so-called lunchbox lectures that we're going to be delivering through the magic of Zoom and Facebook. I will admit, 2 weeks ago I knew nothing about Zoom, and now I've lived on it for the last 2 weeks, and it's really an amazing platform, and of course you all know Facebook. So over the next weeks, we're going to be doing one of these a week, and maybe more than that. This is the tip of an iceberg of online content that the National World War II Museum is going to be beaming your way over the next weeks and months while we're all cooped up in our homes and apartments. So I would ask you, please make our website and Facebook page kind of your regular go-to destinations. Check them early and often every day. Maybe make it your first stop when you wake up. Our twin themes and all this content that we're going to be bringing you, and we thought about this as a museum, is first of all, our work continues. We have a mission at the museum to make sure that the memory of World War II and the American experience of World War II is evergreen, and we're going to continue that. Nothing stops that. But second, we're all in this together because we were then, and frankly, we are now. We're a democracy, and that means citizens have to take an active part, and they have to be part of the solution whenever there's a crisis that arises. That was then, and it's the same thing now. So please do check us out. We understand you can't come to see us for a while here in New Orleans, but we're going to be coming to see you with regularity. Well, you've all heard the phrase, I'm sure. We often say that the U.S. was utterly unprepared for World War II. Pearl Harbor, people say, came like a bolt out of the blue. Suddenly the country was at war, and we had to scramble to respond while under fire, which is, of course, the worst combination of circumstances possible. You want to be able to consider your response and think about it and be careful, but in a sense, all of a sudden we were at war, and just like those American sailors at Pearl Harbor, literally getting bombed out of the blue in a way, that's how the country felt as well. Now, you know what historians do now. That's not completely true. The complete unpreparedness of the nation. Now, President Roosevelt Franklin D. Roosevelt, our president since 1933, had been in office a long time, and he'd watched the international situation deteriorate. Hitler coming to power in Germany, the militarists rising to power in Japan. And he had come to realize that the global situation was unstable, was serious. The future was dangerous any way you sliced it. And so the US would certainly be drawn into war at some point in the future. Even if it didn't wish to be, it was probably going to happen. There's an old saying that you may not be interested in war, but war may be interested in you. You don't always get to choose the wars you fight. Sometimes they come calling to you. So Roosevelt wants to prepare the nation for war. But the trouble is, most of his people aren't interested. Most of the American people are not interested in going to war. They're not interested in preparing for war. They just had a war, World War I, which America fought from 1917 to 1918. And I think if you ask most Americans what we got out of that war, the answer is, yeah, I'm not quite sure, because it looks like we're gearing up to do it again against one of the same opponents, Germany. So what did that war solve? And I think that was kind of contemporary wisdom for most Americans during much of the Roosevelt presidency. So he wants to prepare the country, but the trouble is most of his people aren't really on board. So you've heard, I suppose, at some point, the I word in American history, isolationism. It has a bad sound today. It sounds like, you're sticking your head in the sand. You're in bed, as Roosevelt once famously said, and you're drawing the covers up over your head like little children do. How do they pretend that things are okay? They hide and they put the covers over their head. But of course, that doesn't solve the problem. So the mood of isolation is out there in the country. Now, we can call it, you can say it's sensible. Look at what happened in World War I. What do we gain from that? You could say, hey, man, these people have their head in the sand. You can judge it various ways. But the point is, to a politician like Roosevelt, is isolationism is there. Whether you like it or don't like it, it's a fact that you have to deal with. So it's real, and FDR knows it. There's a very famous description or a definition of politics. What is politics? It's the art of the possible. You might want to turn the United States into a perfect society overnight, but you're probably going to fail. And so you have to decide, what is possible going forward, and make those your preliminary goals, and then maybe lead on to bigger things. But if there's any master of the political process in the United States, in the entire history of the country, any master of the political process, it's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the master politician. You don't get elected president 4 times without some heavy political chops, and Roosevelt definitely had them. Kate, can we put up President Roosevelt so people can get a look at? There's a really good shot of President Roosevelt. A little later in his presidency, please note that quote. We'll get to it in a moment, but there's a good look at FDR. So isolationism is real, and FDR knows that too. So he thinks there's going to be a war. He also knows the American people aren't really interested in getting involved in fighting it. He believes that sooner or later war will come calling. He's not sure how, but he knows that the country has to prepare. So what does he do? He undertakes a series of initiatives, limited in some ways, always within the constitutional powers of the presidency, which, if you haven't read the Constitution lately, I urge you all to go out and give it a read. The powers of the president are vast in the American constitutional system, a kind of uncrowned king in some ways, but we can talk about that if you wish. So he undertakes a series of initiatives within the constitutional powers of the presidency to do a couple of things. Help potential allies who, by 39 and 40, there already is a shooting war, the Germans in Europe and the Japanese in China, to help potential allies weather the storm, to restore the global order. These are what he's interested in doing. So first, in October 1940, President Roosevelt institutes a draft conscription, the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. It's only for 1 year. And he also supplies a reassuring message to all those moms and dads out there. And you can read it on the bottom of the screen below the president's name there. Your boys, he tells the American people, are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. So it's October of 1940, the draft begins. We've never had a peacetime draft in American history. You may know from deep in the American past, we mistrust standing armies. It's one of the reasons we fought the Revolutionary War against the British. But the time, Roosevelt believes, the time has now come. So it's in October 1940, and it's only for a year. So if you were drafted in October 1940, you can do the math, you'd be getting out in October of 1941. And a lot of those draftees were already, when you're doing something for a year, you can begin to count down what's 1 month off. There's another week, another month down. And the joke was, you scrawl on your locker or your duffel bag, Ohio, OHIO. I'm over the hill in October. In other words, I'm out of here in October 1941. Now, it didn't work out that way because problems are going to arise. The crisis will get worse, and the term of the drafted soldiers will be longer than that. But it's only for 1 year, and there's that reassuring signal that Roosevelt sends to the American people. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. He gets the Lend-Lease Act passed in March of 1941. Kate, can we have the slide? Now, the Lend-Lease Act allowed weapons and supplies to be sent to any country, I'm quoting, whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States. So it's pretty broad power. The president can make a determination. And basically what that would mean at the time would be Great Britain fighting the Germans, it would be China, the Republic of China, mainland China, fighting the Japanese. But there's a good view of some Tommy guns, Lend-Lease being sent off to Britain in this case. He has that new draft army, which very soon balloons to 1 million men. There were, give or take, there are about 135 million Americans alive at the time. That was the population of the country. We're about 2.5 times that today, 300 million, over 300 million, but 135 at the time. And soon the American army numbers over 1 million men. Up until that draft, the American army was 17th largest in the world, just ahead of Romania, medium-sized power in Eastern Europe, but certainly not the vast sprawl and population of the United States. But soon we have 1 million men under arms. Well, it's one thing to put a young man in uniform. It's something else to turn him into a soldier. You go through basic training, and then maybe you go through more specialized training. But there's one more big ingredient that I think has to be added. And Roosevelt has this new army stage a series of large-scale open field maneuvers in the fall, late summer and fall of 1941. So that's Arkansas in August, that's Louisiana, and there's a good view of American tank and the Louisiana maneuvers of 1941. That's our Grant Lee series of tanks. It's got a little gun in the turret. It's got a bigger gun and a kind of a limited traverse. It's called a sponson on the side of the tank. But there's a good view of the Louisiana maneuvers in September, and then in the Carolinas in November. Look, these are not real. There is live ammunition used, but you're not fighting a real battle. But you're getting used to battlefield conditions, to camping out under the stars, to being on the move day and night, to eating cold food by moonlight when you haven't been fed since lunch. All the things that toughen up a young man and really do turn him into a soldier. I think there's no substitution for large-scale maneuvers. So if our Congress people are listening to this in the future for our military, always remember, I think the open field maneuvers are absolutely essential. Men and commanders alike are put to the test. So we're here in fall of 1941. By the time the Japanese do attack Pearl Harbor, the United States has over 1 million men in arms in the Army. The Navy is better prepared. Now, the Army itself is still pretty raw, but it had tested itself under battlefield conditions. And able and aggressive commanders were rising to the top. It's the Louisiana maneuvers where Major Dwight D. Eisenhower first, is noticed by superior officers. Say, this guy is a whiz as a staff officer. He's got low ego. He's low maintenance. He gets the job done. It was the beginning, I think, of Eisenhower's meteoric rise to command in World War II. General George Patton made a name for himself in the Louisiana maneuvers. He had to stay in Louisiana. Patton crosses the river over into Texas and has his armor division gas up at gas stations along the way, recross back into Louisiana, and attack Shreveport from the north. So Shreveport, Louisiana was the city that was being fought over in the Louisiana maneuver. So again, shout out to all my friends in Shreveport. I hope some of you are on the stream right now. So there were preparations. Now, having said that, nobody was ready for what happened on December 7th, 1941. Sure, there were signs the Japanese were thinking about some attack somewhere. Most U.S. policymakers figured that would be the Philippines. Very few people thought about that the Japanese were going to take every single one of their precious aircraft carriers and sail them 3,000 miles across the open expanse of the North Pacific and attack the American fleet at Pearl Harbor from the north. But of course, that's precisely what the Japanese did. Always assume your enemy has greater capabilities than you think he has. That might be a rule call it the Pearl Harbor rule. Never limit, the ingenuity of your adversary. They wanted to strike a blow, the Japanese did, and they struck a serious one. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched their highly successful surprise attack on the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. By the way, you may see occasionally I'm going to be looking down here in case questions are coming in or I'm being given directives about time. So I want to reassure everyone, I'm not looking at my 401k because who wants to see that right now? So December 7th, 1941, extremely successful Japanese surprise attack on the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, which destroys much of it in the process. 2 days later, as if on cue, because it was a cue, Adolf Hitler's Germany declared war on the United States. And the United States, after a couple decades of really trying to stay out, was now truly at war and shaken to their core. The Japanese attack was meant to be a kind of a shock and awe kind of blow, a surprise bolt out of the blue that would not only wreck the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but shock the Americans so much they would realize, well, it's going to be impossible to ever come back against these kind of odds in the Pacific. And that was part of the Japanese calculation. But that didn't work out. The sense of shock that the American people were feeling soon turned to rage, especially rage against the Japanese. It was one thing to have the Germans declare war, and yes, that you can't turn it down. People declare war on you, you're at war with them. But the real American outrage was, of course, directed against the power that had directed the Pearl Harbor raid, carried out the Pearl Harbor raid, and that's Japan. So there's a sense of rage, and that soon turns to a sense of a grim determination to win this war no matter what it took. And America is going to be at war from December of 1941 to September of 1945. So it's less than 4 years. But in that 4 years, while there were occasional moments of war weariness because the casualties were high and the fight was bitter, and some days the news seemed horrible, like you just didn't want to read a newspaper. Similar to today, I suppose. Despite all those problems and the low points, I would say that the determination of the American people to carry on the struggle never really diminished in any way, shape, or form. I think that's probably true. Now, surveying the wreckage of their fleet in the days and weeks after Pearl Harbor, American leaders at all levels realized that coming back from this disaster wasn't going to be easy. Nobody sold anyone a bill of goods like, hey, we'll take care of this next week, or it'll be done in a month. It wasn't going to be easy. Winning this war was going to mean converting a peacetime economy that was designed to produce consumer goods. Ford Motors, for example, producing, as you know, automobiles. But here is the monster Ford plant at Willow Run, Michigan, outside of Ypsilanti, now, converted to 4-engine bombers. And we can leave that one up for a while. We'll have some occasion to talk about it later as well. But you had to take that peacetime economy, consumer goods, and convert it to wartime. You had to produce millions of tons of supplies, tens of thousands of aircraft and planes, specialized equipment to cross the oceans, amphibious craft to land massive armies on foreign shores. The problem, if you're America and you're fighting Japan and Germany, is you're separated by an ocean on both sides. Normally that's good. It gives the country some protection. But if you're going to carry the fight to the enemy, in both these cases, you're going to have to produce gigantic armies that are then able to be loaded on ships and boats, and enough of those ships and boats to carry the whole thing abroad and get it ready to carry out its duty. So you had to land massive armies on foreign shores, and I would say the number one challenge from the very beginning of our involvement in World War II was that one. Above all, there was a question, and that was, could the U.S. produce, train, and equip the high-quality fighting forces that were going to be needed to get this job done? So Pearl Harbor is December 7th, and those questions are swirling around Washington over the next couple of months. While policymakers were asking those tough questions, and that's the kind of policymakers you want, people are facing reality of a tough situation. the American people were demanding action. They didn't want to sit around. You know, the most dangerous words you hear as a politician is when the American people are saying, we've got to do something. Because, you know, you got to do something. You got elected, and if you want to keep getting elected, you have to remain responsive to the people. But you also want to make sure you're doing not just something, but the right thing. So the American policymakers are asking questions. The American people are demanding action. And, you know, what they want, just to put it in its most basic form, they want revenge, vengeance for what happened at Pearl Harbor. So, what were the action items then that I think we can point to? I basically list them as 3. Perhaps what was most important is what the United States did not do in response to Pearl Harbor. From FDR on down, U.S. commanders knew that the very worst course of action they could take would be to go off half-cocked and launch some hastily designed, poorly planned, under-resourced military operation. There's the worst thing you could do. Yes, it might make people feel better. Well, at least the first day when you see pictures in the newsreels and in the newspapers, how people got the news, you hear reports on the radio at the time, we're sailing off to attack Europe. Yeah, that'd make you feel better for a couple of days if you're the American people. But then again, a week later, it might have failed tragically and disastrously, and then nobody's feeling good. And then launching a second one, because you just wasted all the new equipment you produce, launching the second one takes months, if not years. I mean, what I've always been impressed by U.S. policymakers in World War II was the fact that they realized, before coming to grips with Germany and Japan, patience had to be the order of the day. And so I think the first action item is kind of inaction. It's to be patient and make sure that we have what it takes to go on and get the job done. December 1941, of course, is Pearl Harbor, and I guess the iconic moment for Americans in Europe would be our boys storming Omaha Beach in June of 1944. That's how long that took to prepare that. It's 2.5 years. And then in the Pacific, it's, you know, our Marines on Iwo Jima, and that's not to February of 1945. That's a long time after Pearl Harbor. So there had to be some patience, even though I would say in wartime and in crisis time, patience is probably the thing that's in shortest supply. After patience came production. I'm not doing this on purpose as a series of alliterations beginning with P, but I think that's the way they're going to work out. So along with patience came production, industrial production. In January of 1942, FDR created the War Production Board, the WPB, to convert industries from peace to wartime, to allocate scarce materials of, you know, collecting rubber for the thousands and tens of thousands and millions of tires that are going to be necessary for all these vehicles. Prohibiting non-essential production. Nylon stockings, I guess, might be one to mention. Refrigerators for the consumer market. If, you know, Frigidaire wants to keep moving during World War II, they're going to have to convert to wartime production, and they do, producing aircraft parts and sometimes whole aircraft. And that's just one example amongst thousands. The WPB, War Production Board, enacted a series of measures to control wages and prices. We like the market in America as a way of regulating how much people make and what things cost, but there was an emergency, and for the time being, we're going to have some central direction from Washington. This production was going to have to include production of vehicles and ships, tanks and aircraft, rifles and artillery. All of these measures skyrocket. The number of cartridges, that is bullets, produced by U.S. industry in World War II is in the hundreds of millions, and maybe even more than that. But production skyrocketed in 1942 as the United States became what FDR liked to call, it's a great phrase, it's the name of one of our galleries at the National World War II Museum, which I hope when this is all passed over, you'll come and visit us and see it for yourself, the arsenal of democracy. That's how Roosevelt saw the United States. We were going to produce for ourselves, but we're also going to produce for all those other countries who were fighting alongside us to vanquish Imperial Japan and and Nazi Germany. The arsenal of democracy, it turned into an economy that could practically outproduce the rest of the world combined all by itself. So we have this picture of the Willow Run assembly plant, a B-24 Liberator bomber, which is what you're seeing on that assembly line. Henry Ford said, we can produce one of those an hour. People said, you're crazy. And, you know, it's the same thing they said to him about producing the Model T and everything else he'd done before. It's an assembly line over a mile long, and it has an L shape. I mean, it bends. It goes off on a 90-degree angle to keep the whole thing inside the same county. I will, full disclosure, I lived in Ypsilanti, Michigan for many years, and that's Washtenaw County, Michigan. If you kept the whole thing in the same county, you were better off for tax purposes. But Kaiser shipyards will be turning out gigantic transports called Liberty ships at a rate of 1 per week as this war goes on. And so over and over again, I think we have another shot, Kate, of Consolidated, don't we? There's Consolidated Aircraft, the Fort Worth assembly plant, you know, but you can just see you can count. I mean, it's not countless, but it's like an infinity of aircraft. And all these plants look the same way. And that was, you know, coast to coast in the United States, ships and tanks and guns and planes just being churned out in an abundance that almost, I'm an Italian, I talk, I got words for everything, I wave my arms crazily. Sometimes I lack words to say exactly, you know, what the productive capacity of the United States was, because it was essentially shouldering much of the burden of not only itself, but also its allies. So patience and production. And then finally, my third P, as things have turned out, planning. Soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor, General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, and there he is, the great architect and planner of World War II, began carefully shifting through various operational possibilities. And if anyone learned it, he learned it first, that any operation we were likely to undertake, either to fight across the Pacific or to fight across Europe, was going to require very, very careful planning. And he was sifting through his various options. He knew that the war against Nazi Germany, and that was the war that was seen as potentially more difficult. The Japanese economy is a fraction the size of the US economy. The German economy much larger, its war production much larger, and of course it controlled the resources of much of conquered Europe. So the war against Nazi Germany had to take a kind of priority, even though the Americans want Japan taken care of, the American people want Japan taken care of first. But he knew the war against Nazi Germany could only be won in one way. There was no magic solution. You had to put together a gigantic military force, a gigantic army, I'll say, with due consideration for all the other services as well. You had to deploy it in Great Britain. And then from there, you had to invade Western Europe to get directly at the German armed forces. I've spent a lifetime writing on the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces of World War II. That was the way you had to get at them directly. Our ally, Winston Churchill in Britain, wanted to sort of nibble a bit more around the edges of the Nazi Empire. A bit concerned about this direct thrust into the heart of Nazi power. But from the beginning, that's what Marshall was looking to do. But he also knew that until he had the men, the equipment, such an action could well turn into a fiasco. And it was probably a one-shot deal. If you did it, you tried it, and it failed, you weren't going to be launching another one anytime soon. So, planning for what eventually became known as Operation Overlord. Operational names go through. There's Operation Bolero, which is the build-up in Britain. There's Operation Sledgehammer, the original thoughts of an invasion. Eventually, Overlord is the title that's settled on. Planning for Operation Overlord, an Allied landing in Nazi-occupied Europe, began in 1942. And of course, as I presume many people watching this would know, it was not carried out until June of 1944. It took 2 years and some change to get it ready. But planning was a slow and often frustrating process, and of course made more frustrating by the insistent demands of the American people that something be done. And you know who else every now and then goosed the military into action? President Franklin Roosevelt. he's the man in closest contact with U.S. public opinion, of course, and he's hearing about it every day from his senator, from his aides, and from senators and from congressmen. The American people want action, but above all, what the military forces are doing in this period, they're training, and they're training. They're preparing themselves for modern war. And it's going to be horrible enough when they do carry out overlord or operations in the Pacific, culminating in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They're going to be difficult enough, even for a very well-trained and extremely well-equipped U.S. military force. So I guess if we put all that together, what do we wind up with? As a result of all that, the opening phase of World War II was extremely frustrating to the American people, to President Roosevelt, to Marshall, undoubtedly to a lot of people. But from the perspective of the public, they were at war. That's what the newspaper said. They could read they were at war. Their sons had been drafted. Their daughters were off doing war work or flying aircraft as WASP. They were at war. The family car was up on the blocks. You had to surrender the tires to the war effort, and you weren't really going to be getting gas for it. And the symbol of U.S., I guess, family life, right? The U.S. consumer life is the family has a car, but not for the duration of the war. They didn't. The American people didn't know how long this was going to last. There was the phrase, "You got drafted. How long am I in for?" For the duration. See, we have the advantages. We know it's finite. We know when World War II ended, but we always have to remember people who fought at the time did not know that. So the family car is up on the blocks. Their food is being rationed. Try cooking without butter or sugar or anything, and see what you come up with. Food rationing was a real problem. But where was the actual fighting? In Europe, not much happened at all in 1942. There was a slow buildup of U.S. troops in Great Britain. Late in the year, started bombing German cities and industrial facilities. There was a landing in French North Africa, Operation Torch, but that's at the very end of the year. That's in November. And it was Marshall and some others weren't that thrilled about doing it, but Roosevelt said, look, it's imperative we get into action somewhere against Germany in 1942. And Germany has forces in North Africa, Rommel's famous Afrika Korps, which is fighting against the British. This was a way to bring U.S. troops into actual action. Roosevelt thought it was absolutely imperative. In Asia, sadly, there was a lot of action. But much of it was bad. Now, during the first 6 months of the war in the Pacific, Japanese armies and fleets rampaged across the world's greatest ocean, overrunning U.S. forces in the Philippines, the British in Malaya, the Dutch in the East Indies, the modern nation of Indonesia. If we can get to the next slide, Kate. The fall of the Philippines saw a U.S. Army and its Filipino allies fall into Japanese hands. Last-ditch stand, first in the Bataan Peninsula, then in Corregidor, island of Corregidor, and then marched off to prisoner of war camps and brutal conditions in the interior of the country. Probably heard at some point in your life of the Bataan Death March. And this was the news the American people were reading out of the Pacific. This picture to me is about the perils of not being prepared. And who's paying the price? It's not the people who made the decisions not to be prepared. It's those who, out of civic duty or draft, went over to the Philippines to represent our country and to fight for the flag. And I would urge all Americans to, look at a photo or two of some of the early action in World War II sometime and get a view of what it means to be unprepared. But it's events like this, the Japanese, Kate, I think if we go to the last slide now, please. And there's the Japanese Empire at its greatest extent, 6 months into World War II. Japan has been fighting a war in China for some time. As much of China is in Japanese hands. The East Indies, Singapore, the Malay Peninsula, it's a giant, in terms of square miles, it's probably as large an empire as has ever been conquered by anyone. At some point, late 41, early 42, Germany and Japan might have seemed to many people to be impossible to stop. Like, there's no way we'll ever roll that back, or there's no way we'll ever roll the Germans fought their way to the very outskirts of Moscow in December 1941. There's no way we'll ever roll those gains all the way back. And that may well be how the Germans and Japanese themselves felt. Depending on when you got Hitler, what kind of mood he was in. There were times when everything seemed that the world conquest was in his grasp, and other times he had a mercurial personality. But certainly the Japanese achievement here, maybe they were feeling 10 feet tall too. Maybe they felt that they were impossible to stop. But if they'd only been listening a little more carefully, those Axis leaders, they could have heard a faint hum in the distance. You know, growing louder by the day. U.S. factories producing weapons and supplies, tanks and planes, 24/7 at a pace never before seen in human history. And those weapons being produced by a people who were united in their determination to triumph. And this, to me, is really the lesson of sort of recovering from Pearl Harbor. This was the crucial year of the war, maybe the crucial 6 months of the war, when we concentrated on patience, production, and planning. The 3 Ps that eventually paid off in victory for the United States and its allies. So those are the comments, the prepared comments I have for you today. I think we're about at the 35-minute mark. I've got some wizards who are back at the ranch, the virtual ranch. And let me see what we have, if any questions have come in yet. Anything from you guys over on the Facebook feed? Yeah, okay. So it takes a couple of seconds for this to happen. So let me I have a series of questions here, and once again, you know, I promise I'm not checking out my email. Lois wants to know. Hello, Lois. Is there a book you recommend on the 1941 maneuvers? And yes, there's a number of good books on the 1941 maneuvers. I think my favorite would be a book that was written within the U.S. military community by a guy named Christopher Gable, and I think it's called The Louisiana Maneuvers of 1941, or The Great Maneuver, GHQ, General Headquarters Maneuvers of 1941. It looks at all of them. It's not just Louisiana, because the Carolina and Arkansas maneuvers are fascinating as well. The Louisiana ones, we're down here in Louisiana, that's why we have an obsession with them. But at the same time, they kind of captured, I think, more than the other two, the imagination of the nation. You know, just share one thing in the Louisiana maneuvers. At the end of the blue is fighting red. You know, you have colors, so it's blue team versus red team. And it's real American soldiers and tanks on both sides. But now the general defending Shreveport, Patton's coming down from the north, and a defense is put up against him. And it's the end of the maneuvers. The directors blow the whistle and say, maneuvers are over. So Shreveport staged a gigantic victory parade. They'd successfully defended the city against, you know, Patton's raid from the north. And it's in all the newspapers. Go check out the Shreveport newspapers from September of 1941. Every single headline is hilarious. They say things like, Reds on the march. You're like, wait, is this the Cold War? Are these the Soviets invading Louisiana? But it's the red team versus the blue team. So that would be my recommendation. I've written on it. Virtually anyone who's written on kind of the origins of World War II, especially the origins of the U.S. Army, you're always going to find some good information on the Louisiana maneuvers. If I may, about the early history of World War II, but also U.S. prep to fight World War II, U.S. preparations to fight it. You can't do any better than the master himself, Rick Atkinson, who multiple Pulitzer Prize-winning author and a great human being and a wonderful guy, who's also written a trilogy on the U.S. Army in World War II. And so the first of the trilogy is An Army at Dawn. It's about this new U.S. Army that was formed to fight World War II and how it marched off and took its lumps early and eventually had fought itself into pretty good shape by the end of that period. Let's see. Kirk. Hello, Kirk. What exact part of telecommunications were faulty so as not to warn America of the surprise attack? I'm not sure we're really talking about telecommunications failure. Information was flowing in on all levels. There was a few blips coming in towards Pearl Harbor on radar that a radar operator said, well, I haven't heard any news. This must be a flight of B-17s. They're being expected to land on Oahu later today. So I'm not sure it's telecommunications as much as it was kind of, I don't want to say operator error to blame that poor guy, but just in general, this was a peacetime intelligence gathering agency because there had been no war since 1918. One side is in deadly earnest, and the other side isn't. We had cracked the Japanese diplomatic code, so-called Purple Code. So we were reading messages, east wind, rain, north wind, rising, that were coded. And some folks knew that that was a signal that perhaps the Japanese were not aiming at another strike into the Soviet Union, were not aiming in Manchuria, or excuse me, we're not aiming deeper into China, but might be launching some kind of strike on the United States. But even that didn't necessarily mean Pearl Harbor. I'm not making excuses because, excuses are a dime a dozen. But why the United States was not better prepared for Pearl Harbor is filled the history books and the library since 1941. It's a few years back now, maybe a decade, but a guy named U.S. I believe Army JAG, I think, Fred Borch, B-O-R-C-H, and Danny Martinez, who was the guru of all things Pearl Harbor. He was the lead director of the USS Arizona Museum in Pearl Harbor. Danny's genius on this stuff. They wrote a book together, which kind of, summed up, they weren't really doing original research on it, but they summed up everything that everybody had amassed, all the information that had been amassed. And, if you add it all up and you and I are sitting there and we say, man, oh man, somebody should have been able to figure that out, Kirk. But we're not there. We're sitting here and we have nothing else on our plate to talk about this issue. So sometimes when I give that answer, I know it's unsatisfying to people. There have been no dearth, no lack of conspiracy theories about who knew what beforehand. I was interviewed, I was on radio for something at the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, which would be 2016. And I said this: there was no conspiracy involving President Roosevelt, because there wasn't. And then, I got back to my office and the phone was already ringing off the hook. And, about people who really do believe in their heart of hearts, and they have various explanations for it. Some are more plausible than others. But I'm not sure, the point is, I'm not sure it was a telecommunications failure as much as a failure of human interaction and a failure of the synchronization of various intelligence agencies, each of whom had a piece of the puzzle but was unable to put the whole thing together. Thomas asks me, hello, Thomas, is U.S. production the reason for victory in World War II? A nice, direct, big question. So here, I'll answer it in a couple of ways. The first answer is yes, of course. We outproduced everybody else, and we had more of everything. And in modern war, that helps. If you want to fight a modern war, or let's say you want to be a soldier, would you rather be in the Army that has U.S. Army Air Forces streaming overhead nonstop, thousands of bombers supporting it, thousands of fighters supporting it? You want to be in that army, or you want to be in an army that has half of that? And I think the answer is obvious. So U.S. production, ships and planes and everything you can possibly imagine, played a huge role in the victory. But here's where I get a little nervous, and I think you probably know where I'm heading here. You can produce all the weapons in the world. If you don't have the people to wield them, if they're not well trained, or they're unclear about their purpose, or their officers are not serious professionals, which is what modern military officers ought to be, serious professionals who study their craft and try to stay abreast of all the latest developments. If you don't have any of those things, then it doesn't matter how many weapons you produce. I've been reading lately. So we're the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. We obviously were part of the World War II Museum, but we tried to think about other wars and the relationship between democratic systems and how democratic systems fight wars. I've been reading about Alexander the Great lately. And in 331 BCE, at the Battle of Gaugamela, he commanded, 40,000 men, and he beat a Persian army under Darius III that was 4 to 5 or 6 times the size of his own. The night before, he gathered the men and said, look, I know things look tough. That army out there is huge. But remember that you're free men, and they're not. You're better trained than they are. You've beaten them already. You have me, Alexander said. And they're stuck with Darius, and he's no match for me. So I don't think we can ever say that simple industrial production is the key to victory in any kind of modern wartime situation. I think, although I'm probably overstating here, it can be insulting to the men and women who actually fought the war. Let's say, you know what? That day when I was out on Iwo Jima and my rifle jammed and I was up against it and all I had was my knife. You know, the Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, and you know, Operation Shoestring, it's often called, because we had just won a victory at Midway and wanted to keep the initiative in our hand. And the Marines, there's a division available, landed them on Guadalcanal. Very little planning, very little advanced thought to logistics or supply. And then, you know, the fleet departed because Japanese aircraft were active in the area, and our U.S. Marines had to survive on Guadalcanal, eating captured stores of Japanese rice and dried fish. So, you know, you'd have a hard time selling it to the Marines. Well, we produced our way to victory. I mean, we did produce our way to victory, but you also, I think, have to look at, my point is you have to look at both sides of the equation. Let's see what else we have here. Rebecca has a tough one, I'll say. Hello, Rebecca. Don't ever call, but no, I'm just kidding. Rebecca wants to know how much money did the U.S. Oh, wait, excuse me, something just happened. How much money did the U.S. military lose because Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor? I don't know. A lot of money. I mean, I've never studied it. Capital ships. So the principal item in your naval arsenal are your capital ships. The battleship was still considered to be the capital ship, the most important kind of ship. Big guns, you know, 12, 14, 16-inch guns, thick belt armor all around the ship. And those were extremely expensive to produce. And America lost a number of them. You know, a big chunk of the men killed at Pearl Harbor were in the USS Arizona, which was hit by a bomb and then you know, flipped over and entombed everyone inside. So I'm kind of playing around with you a little bit, Rebecca. I don't know the exact figure. But I do know one thing, that in America's World War II experience, money was not really ever the problem. We had the money to take care of issues. We had supply bottlenecks. We had to train sailors and soldiers and Marines and airmen and make sure that they had state-of-the-art training as well as state-of-the-art equipment. We had to work out the logistical quirks of huge landings abroad. Those things, to me, were the real problem. I've never... Well, obviously, the attack on Pearl Harbor was expensive in a monetary sense. I've never really felt that it was the key or that it was the principal factor of that disaster. I do have to say this. My daughter Laura is watching from Kalamazoo, Michigan. Laura, a shout out and hello to you and Eric. I hope everyone's safe in Michigan right now. Let me see anything else here. Rusty, did the Germans or Japanese have 24/7 military production like the Americans? Yes, they did. In both cases, they weren't able to match American production. The Germans, the most horrible aspect of, well, one of the most horrible aspects of the German war effort is the almost complete reliance on slave labor in much of their armament manufacturing sector. You know, I don't know why we're still learning this lesson, why Hitler had to learn this lesson in the 1940s. People who feel like they're in a just cause and are being paid decently and where the conditions are decent will produce far more and far more efficiently than slaves who are, you know, literally being chained to their lathes and drill presses and being fed a starvation diet because when they die, you have some more slaves, either Jews taken from concentration camps or Soviet prisoners of war or whoever it might be. So there was 24/7 production, and in Japan likewise. But neither Japan or Germany ever really achieved, I think, the economies of scale that the vastness of the U.S. Economy allowed the Americans to develop. You can look at a picture of U.S. tanks being churned out on an assembly line, and it's mechanized, man. You look at a picture of German tanks that are being designed, the later Panther, the Mark V or the Mark VI Tiger. individuals are crawling all over them, tightening a bolt, doing this, doing that. It's very little machine power, very little rationality. You might say the Germans were still wedded to like old style craftsmanship in many ways. They're making sophisticated weapons. You know, they weren't churning them out in the abundance that they needed or anywhere near it. The guru on this topic is my friend, historian John Parshall, who writes pretty extensively on the war in the Pacific. He and his partner, Anthony Tully, have a great book out called Shattered Sword about the Battle of Midway. But I've heard John speak on, you know, the sort of mass production on the American end, even the Soviet end too, very crudely produced tanks very often, but produced in abundance. And then the Germans tinkering to get a beautiful Mark VI tank into the field and make sure that it was just right. So, folks, I think I have come to the end of the line today. I want to thank. There's a lot of great questions here, man. I'd love to answer them all, but I think I've come to the end of the line in terms of my time. So, Kate or Chrissy, whoever it is, I'm going to turn it back over to you. But I will say one more thing to folks listening. If you enjoyed this, or maybe you want to hear a better one, next week, same time, same channel. And that's going to be my pal and colleague here at the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National World War II Museum, Dr. Ed Lengel. Ed is an authority on many things, but the one he's going to talk about next week is a tale of U.S. heroism from World War I, the heroes of the Lost Battalion, the U.S. Army in fighting the Germans in 1918. So I'd like to say from the National World War II Museum, but actually from my beautifully appointed living room, this is Dr. Rob Citino. Take care, everyone, and thanks for spending some time with me.